Welcome everyone to the January 24th, 2025 Big Time Fundraising episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the show, some interesting 2024 fundraising numbers for Iowa politicians. A special election for the Iowa Legislature is coming soon, and the first real week of the legislative session generated plenty to discuss. Hello everyone, I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids, and I want you to know that we are reaching a quarterly deadline here, and any dollar that you can contribute to the On Iowa Politics podcast would be very welcome. And I think Todd, I'll let him answer for himself later, but I think he offered to match up to a certain dollar amount too, so your donations go for double. Hey, with me this week are Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief Tom Barton. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
We have Lee Des Moines Bureau Chief Maya Marchel Hoff with us. Hello, Maya.
Hey.
Sarah Watson, that was a greeting from a person at the end of the legislative week, by the way. Sarah Watson, the Quad City Times, is with us. Hello, Sarah.
Greetings, Erin.
Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal, also here. Hello, Jared.
Down with Buffalo, Erin. Down with Buffalo.
Yeah. I won't tell you who I'm personally rooting for, Jared. And Gazette columnist Todd Dorman is here. Hello, Todd.
Hey, and the deal is I will match the first 25 cents of any donation that we get.
Okay, I must have misread the decimal point.
No, I'm just big-hearted that way. I mean, generous to a fault.
We appreciate that. All right, so before we get to the Iowa Legislature, let's first discuss a special election that will be held soon to round out said Iowa Legislature. We're at 149 members right now, which, quite frankly, is more than enough. But because state law requires 150, we're going to have a special election soon in the Quad Cities to round out the August body. We're down one in the Iowa Senate because Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds totally ignored my spectacular and speculative advance story and chose a state senator, Chris Coynoyer, to be her new lieutenant governor. That vacated an eastern Iowa seat in the Senate, and a special election has been called to fill the seat. Sarah, it's in your neck of the woods, so tell us a little bit about the candidates, and if you'd be so kind, handicap this special election for us. What's the district look like? Is this going to be a safe hold for Republicans? I mean, Lord knows they've got a really slim majority, so they can't afford to lose many seats in the Iowa Senate.
Ha ha ha. That was a good joke. So this district, it is a Mississippi River district. It covers all of Clinton County, a little part of Scott County, and part of Jackson County. So the biggest city in the district is Clinton, and it also covers DeWitt, Maquoketa, Princeton, and a part of LeClaire. So this is one of the districts, or at least one of the areas that went from Obama to Trump, one of those districts where Democratic support has really eroded in the last 10 or 15 years. I was going to say, so the Republicans do have a voter registration advantage in the district after this most recent election. So as of January 1st, there are about 14,000 active registered Republicans and about 10,000 active Democrats. And there are about 14,000 no-party voters as well. Trump carried Clinton County this year, and most of the precincts shifted toward Trump compared to 2020. And this is also, I just also want to add, this is likely going to be a low turnout race. There's less than 10 days of early voting, and then, it's in January. So it's not expected to be a real high turnout race like the presidential election. Both candidates are frantically campaigning during this really short election season. And so the candidates then, for the Republicans, Katie Whittington, and for the Democrats, Mike Zimmer. So Katie Whittington, she is a local Republican organizer. She has said on her Facebook page she opposes CO2 pipelines and industrial wind turbines. She supports Reynolds's education savings accounts, and she has called herself a health freedom advocate. She said she's done work for the Children's Health Defense, which is a Robert an RFK-led group, and Health Freedom Iowa, which is a group based in Davenport that has similar goals. And then Mike Zimmer, he's the Democrat. He retired from 42 years in local education and was elected in 2023 to the Central DeWitt Community School Board and is currently there serving as their board president. So Zimmer started out in Miles, Iowa as an industrial technology teacher, and he served in various roles in school districts in DeWitt, North Scott, and Pleasant Valley, including as principal at North Scott. And he retired as director of secondary education for Pleasant Valley School District before. And then once he retired, he ran for school board in DeWitt, and is the president of the school board there. And so Zimmer told me in an interview that he decided to run because he, in the education system, he felt he'd been on the receiving end of legislation in the state house that targets education, and he thinks that with his background, his perspective, his experience in education, he can bring that experience, that perspective to the state house as lawmakers are crafting education legislation. And he was very frank about Democrats' minority being in the super minority in the Senate, but he said he said he's more of a moderate Democrat, and that he's opposed to education savings accounts, or as he calls them, vouchers. And he said that he would always, if he doesn't know a lot about a topic, he has experts that he can call up to talk about it. And he said he basically pledged to be a well-researched lawmaker who is willing to ask questions and provide his perspectives on legislation that Republicans were to put forward. And that's kind of the race in a nutshell. Unfortunately, Katie Whittington had been sick for about the past week, so she missed a forum and had not responded to our request for an interview because she had lost her voice and had been sick. So this is that's the race in a nutshell. It's really short. There's those are the two candidates, and it's a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's such a good point you raised. It's always important to remember, and you broke down the demographics of the district, but that these are always such low turnout affairs that gives you an indication, certainly, but you never know because of such low turnout numbers. I don't think we said specifically. I know I didn't. Tuesday is that election, Sarah?
Yes. Oh, yes. January 28th is the election.
Yeah. So, sorry, go ahead, Jared.
Are they going to be serving out 2 years or 4 years?
4 years.
Okay.
Oh, you mean?
Yeah, whatever was left on her term. Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah, and I don't know that off the top of my head where Senator Cournoyer was. I don't believe she was on the ballot in 2024.
No, she was not.
So that would mean that she most likely has the 2 years left and would be up for re-election in 26. So don't quote me on that, but that's how I would work that legislative math out in my head. Anyways. No. All right. So when that's taken care of, we'll have the full 150, and maybe they'll finally get those legislative directories done up at the Capitol, so us reporters can have those for any Capitol geeks out there. You know what I'm talking about. We're dying to get those legislative directories. Thanks for that, Sarah, and obviously we'll come back next week and get your report on what happened on Tuesday. So meantime, the 140 legislators that are already in the building got to work this past week. It was the first real week of the 2025 legislative session, following up that first week, which per usual was 95% pomp and circumstance. Lots of speechifying, not much real legislating in that first week. And that's always the case. That was not the case this week, as you heard in Maya's weary voice as she said, Todd. Sorry, Maya, I don't mean to pick on you. That was just funny and a perfect encapsulation of how we all feel right now. After a day off to observe Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday, the legislature kicked into high gear with full committee and subcommittee schedules on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. There was more than enough for your friendly Gazette Lee Bureau to have to cover, and far too much to talk about in one podcast. So let's just tackle it this way. It was a busy week. A lot went on. What did we think were some of the highlights? And Maya, we'll start with you. What are maybe one or two things that stood out to you during this first really active week of the session?
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't realize how hectic things actually are with subcommittees, just because there's so many meetings happening at once. The legislatures that I have reported in haven't been like that, so it's just kind of feels like we're all running around like chickens with our heads cut off to kind of.
Maya, real quick, what states are those, and do you know if anybody is hiring to cover those legislatures? I'm make a note here.
I'll pass your resume along.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, but so yeah, just a flurry of subcommittees this week. One thing that I covered yesterday was actually a slew of different bills being considered by different subcommittees in both the House and the Senate, and they all kind of revolved around protecting minors from sexual exploitation, grooming, stuff like that. So I just kind of paired all those into one report, and I thought it was interesting all those came up in just one day. The first one would make grooming, if you're convicted of grooming, you would have to register as a sex offender. I believe last year the legislature criminalized grooming, and so this year they'd want to require people that are convicted of that to register as tier 1 sex offenders. A couple hours after that, there was a hearing on a bill that would basically change the prosecution process for cases where someone either possesses or produces child pornography. And right now, the way that these cases are prosecuted is if someone has multiple images of one child, it's prosecuted as just one offense. But if it's multiple images with different children, it's an offense for each separate person. But they would want to make sure that, dependent on the amount of pictures you have of one child, that each picture separately, even if it is the same child, would be prosecuted just as different offenses. That was interesting. The most interesting one came up today, and it was around regulating AI produced pictures, basically AI produced child pornography. Last year, the legislature passed a bill kind of regulating and criminalizing the production of fabricated photos, I guess, or
deep fakes.
Kind of, yeah. It would take like an existing child and basically edit it and add different things to it, or the picture. But this one, it didn't specifically regulate AI generated images, which a county attorney wrote this current bill and the last bill as well, and he pointed out that these AI generated images, because they're not like of a specific child, they are not criminalized, but they can harm children. He argued they can still harm children because the way AI works is that it pulls from what's on the internet and a bunch of existing content, and it can potentially pull stuff from current images of children, like pornographic images of children. So I just thought that was all really interesting that came down the pipeline. They're kind of interconnected, kind of not, but they're just kind of adjacent. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that was a batch of bills, and some of them, like you said, are building off ones that they've passed the year previously too. Tom, how about you? What stood out to you, and can you answer that question without using the word moratorium?
Unfortunately, I cannot.
I suspected.
I think the biggest thing that stood out to me is early movement that we're seeing on a hands-free driving bill, and that we are seeing House Republican lawmakers already jumping on board to try and move that through the House which is where it's been held up in previous years. So the Senate passed a hands-free driving bill back in 2023. State Senator Mark Lofgren, Republican from, is it Muscatine?
Muscatine is what I was going to say. Yeah.
From southeastern Iowa, Muscatine area, is rerunning that bill that they passed in the Senate. They had a subcommittee on it earlier this week, and that 3-member subcommittee voted unanimously to move that bill forward, to advance it to the full committee. It looks like the Senate will go ahead and pass that bill again, as they have done in previous legislative sessions or in previous years. The big question, as I mentioned, has always been where this goes in the House. You have a wing of House Republicans who have been reticent in years past to push legislation forward. They've been concerned about, in previous years, they've been concerned about how the legislation is worded and crafted. They've had concerns about enforcement. How do you realistically enforce this? You've had some House Republicans say that they feel that we should be that the scope should be more broad, that more broadly lawmakers should be looking at curbing or preventing all manner of distracted driving, not just using a cell phone or using a mobile device in the car, and feel that instead of just focusing on the phone and whether the phone is in somebody's hand, that again, it should be, I guess, a little bit more holistic or broader of approach, looking at distracted driving in general. What was interesting is that we're already seeing some early momentum in the House. House or State Representative, David Young, Republican from Van Meter, who is the chair of the House Transportation Committee, also this week introduced similar legislation. It's not a companion bill. It's not the same bill as the Senate, but those two versions are very similar. They're very close in their language and what they would do. And he has been having conversations and working with Senator Lofgren in the Senate to essentially work on the same track, and talked about how this could be the year that lawmakers finally pass and Governor Reynolds signs a hands-free driving bill, bolstered in large part because of the governor's backing of getting a hands-free driving bill across the finish line. As we've probably stated on this podcast previously about the governor's state of the or condition of the state address, Governor Reynolds mentioned that in her address, and threw her weight and support behind the bill, pressed and urged lawmakers to finally get something done on this front, to save lives, to protect Iowans on the road, and to make sure that additional Iowa families don't have to go through the pain and anguish that other families have gone through who have lost loved ones to drivers who have been distracted on or by their phone. During the Senate subcommittee meeting, we heard from some of those families, some of those Iowans who have been personally impacted and have lost grandsons and daughters because of drivers who were texting on their phone or using an app, or were otherwise, using their phone or distracted by the phone instead of, paying attention to the road. So the bill that's moving forward right now in the Senate is, again, similar to what we've seen in previous years. It would require, or essentially, it would ban handheld use of a cell phone while driving, while in the car. It makes an exception for voice activated or hands-free functions. There's also exceptions for, I think, getting an emergency alert on your phone, or getting weather notifications. There's exceptions for police officers, first responders, other professions as part of their official duties, as part of their job, still being able to use a mobile device in the car.
And to that, I thought it was noteworthy too, Tom, and you touched on the two people working on this. I was, and I don't know whether this necessarily means anything, but I found it interesting in observing that when Representative David Young came to talk to us on Press Row about that bill this week, that he made the concerted effort to go get Senator Mark Lofgren and bring him with him to talk about that bill. And maybe that was just symbolic and it doesn't necessarily mean anything going forward, but it sort of suggested to me like he was trying to tell us, look, we're being serious about this year. We're working across the chambers on this, so we've got a bill that's going to come together and get to the governor.
Yeah, and just last point on that, we spoke to House Speaker Pat Grassley earlier this afternoon, and without making any promises or commitments that yes, House Republicans are going to pass it, he did say that they are, I guess, more open to the conversation this year. He did say that there seems to be more of a willingness, or I guess openness, on part of members of the House Republican caucus to finally get something done, and talked about the governor has definitely made this a higher priority, or essentially has elevated the issue by mentioning it in her condition of the state address, and acknowledged that having the governor's backing behind it definitely puts more momentum behind the effort, in addition to a coalition of Iowa business leaders who are backing this law. You've got this coalition, this statewide campaign, primarily being led by the Iowa Bicycle Coalition. But I mean, at the subcommittee meeting, we also heard insurers and automobile makers and other business interests in the state saying that they support this. We heard from Nationwide, and we heard from I think somebody from General Motors, talking about this is a priority for them. So given that the governor is backing this, and given that we have this kind of large coalition of business interests saying we want this, I think that those are all positive signs and positive indications this year that, as lawmakers said, this could finally get done. I've been talking way too long, but I can't end this without talking about the casino moratorium. What was interesting about that is the first bill we saw introduced that would impose a casino moratorium wasn't in the House, which has led that effort and led that discussion, especially last year. As we had mentioned in previous podcasts, it was the House that passed a amendment that would impose a casino moratorium at the very final hours of the session, only to see it get stopped in the Senate. The Senate didn't take that up last session because it was at the very end of the session. So timing was a very large factor, but we've also heard that the other issue is that there just wasn't the votes in the Senate to pass a casino moratorium. And, I had written stories and talked to State Representative Bobby Kaufman, Republican from Wilton, who's chair of the House Ways and Means Tax Policy Committee, who, led that casino moratorium effort in the House last year, and had said that, he was going to champion this again this year, and was determined to fast track something to get it in under the wire before the Iowa Racing and Gaming Commission meets February 6th, where they're expected to vote and make a final determination on a casino application, Cedar Rapids casino application. But anyway, it was not Bobby's bill that we saw drop first. It was actually from the Senate. So we've got these two competing, and then later today, Representative Kaufman introduced his bill. So we have two different bills. You've got the Senate bill, you've got the House bill, and no agreement between the House or the Senate on, which one they're going to move forward, which one they want to see passed. So the House and the Senate versions would both institute a 5-year moratorium. So it would prohibit the Iowa Racing and Gaming Commission from issuing any or granting any new casino licenses in the state through June 30th of 2030. The House version, however, goes considerably further. And after that 5-year moratorium, spells out criteria for how any new gaming license in Iowa would be granted. It lists a whole set of criteria that the Racing and Gaming Commission would have to consider if it were to, approve a new casino in the state, after that 5-year cutoff. And the way that it's worded, it essentially would mean that there could not be a casino in Cedar Rapids, and also says that anywhere else in the state you couldn't have a casino if it's determined, and if market studies are to show that it's going to essentially cannibalize revenue or take existing revenue from existing casino facilities.
Yep, it's good. Next week's going to be really interesting, and like you said, Tom, the timeline on this is super tight. That February 6th date is not that far away, legislatively speaking. There's basically no room for error.
Well, and I asked that today of Representative Kaufman. I said, okay, look, you've introduced your bill today. They've got a subcommittee on that bill scheduled for Monday around the noon hour. And then there's a committee meeting scheduled later that day, that evening, where the committee could go ahead and take that bill up the same day. Theoretically, the subcommittee could meet at 12:30, vote to advance the bill to the full committee. The full committee meets at 5 o'clock. And then potentially the committee could vote to advance the bill and forward it on for a floor vote on the House. And you could potentially have a House floor vote either later that week or first thing the following week, and then get something to the Senate, which, would give them maybe a week, maybe a little bit more than a week to do anything. But, anybody who's familiar with how things work under the Golden Dome knows that things do not move quickly in the Iowa Senate. So I don't know. It's a really tough window. It's a tough needle for them to thread. Who knows if they're going to be able to move fast enough and build enough consensus and support to get something done before that February 6th deadline.
Yeah, I think that's the key. And also what you mentioned or alluded to earlier about the different bills, and there hasn't been cross-chamber negotiation on this yet. If those things had happened, then yes. Yeah. And we've seen bills get called up and be down to the governor within literal days.
We saw that with the education savings accounts,
right,
and other proposals. But given one, that we haven't seen companion bills, right? That it seems to be differences in the legislation. There's no conversation that apparently House leadership has had with Senate leadership about where to go. And also, we haven't heard from the governor on this issue. The governor has not publicly indicated where she stands and, whether or not she would sign a casino moratorium if it gets to her desk. So the fact that, one, this is not necessarily a priority of the governor, and at this moment doesn't necessarily seem to be a priority of Senate leadership, who knows where it goes from here.
Yep. We'll obviously see. And like I said, it's kind of one of those things. There's time, they can do it, but man, the margin for error is very small. So we'll see. I'll take a quick crack at this too. And just one kind of bill that stood out to me this week. I guess it took me a little bit by surprise, and maybe it shouldn't have. Maybe that's on me as much as it is just on what happened. But there was a first hearing held on the bill proposed by Iowa Attorney General Brenna Bird that would be an eventual proposal to ask the voters to amend the Iowa Constitution, and it's relating to children testifying in court. So I'll do this as quickly as I can. But the backstory is important here. For years and years, like all other states, Iowa's had arrangements in law where if a child is going to be asked to testify in court, under certain circumstances, they are allowed to do a remote testimony, so they don't have to testify in front of potentially their alleged abuser, literally feet away. And then there's obvious reasons why in some cases that would want to be avoided. This past year, the Iowa Supreme Court issued an opinion that basically said that that's unconstitutional. It violates the accused's right to face their accuser. And the effect of that was that Iowa became, according to the Iowa Association for Justice, the literal only state in the country that doesn't allow for children to testify remotely. So again, that was based on the Supreme Court's reading of the Iowa Constitution. So Iowa Attorney General Barton has proposed amending the Constitution to say, hey, look, like in certain cases, it's okay for state law to establish the ability for children, and there's some certain other classes included, to be able to testify remotely in front of a judge. And so that bill got its first hearing this week, and the discussion became very interesting. It kind of seems like one of those when you first hear about it, it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Of course, we need to be able to do that. But the Iowa Association for Justice was represented at the meeting. It was a defense attorney, and he very passionately opposed the proposal and said, like, I get why people are here advocating for children who and the difficult positions that they can be put in, but I'm here to represent the accused and, innocent until proven guilty. And he said, I've talked to people who have been falsely accused of sexual assault. So, and it just kind of created this really, and I guess I bring that up because if I'm trying to think of something I didn't expect to see this first week, that was one of them. And like I said, that kind of felt like one to me going into it. And well, this is going to be a no-brainer, pass it along kind of thing. And it was a really interesting debate, and the legislators weren't fully on board with it. They advanced the bill, but with some spoken hesitation. So it'll be interesting to follow that one as it goes through the process too. All right. One thing the legislature did not get to this week, and it may not have to at all, given Governor Kim Reynolds' plans, was Medicaid work requirements. Legislative Republicans had planned to introduce legislation that would establish work requirements for able-bodied Iowans who receive Medicaid benefits. And then Reynolds, in her condition of the state address, announced that she is instructing the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services to apply for a waiver so the state can enact Medicaid work requirements, basically sidestepping the need for legislation. Todd, you're writing about that this week. Give us a tease of what your thoughts are here.
Well, I'm just glad I'm not subject to work requirements, because that would significantly cut my standard of living. But back when Trump first became president, the federal government started issuing waivers to states that wanted to do this, to basically set a standard that said if you're an able-bodied adult, there's a long acronym for able-bodied adult without children, which is used a lot. And states could do that. They could say you have to work so many hours each week or each month to stay eligible for Medicaid. Along the way, a lot of those laws or a lot of those programs were basically struck down by the courts. And but some did survive long enough to be studied to see what their effectiveness was. Arkansas is one that has been studied a lot. They enacted a work requirement, and mainly what researchers have found is that two things happened. Number one, 18,000 people lost their Medicaid coverage, and the main reason they lost their coverage was because the process of sort of reporting your work was so confusing that a lot of people that were still eligible just fell out of the program. And number two, they didn't see any increase in the employment rate of Medicaid recipients, nor did they work longer hours or have higher earnings. So basically all of the rationale for why you would do this is, didn't happen. I guess if the state wants to create a system where people fall off the Medicaid rolls because they can't figure out how to stay on them, that would be one thing. I haven't heard them say that, but I suspect that's probably a fringe benefit. And this isn't really like unemployment or food assistance. I mean, this is, medical insurance. So if people lose it, they're going to be even less employable because they're not receiving care for their various illnesses. So yeah, it's kind of a bad idea if you look at the research.
Yeah, and I'll be totally honest. That's interesting. We haven't had to report on this yet, other than Governor Reynolds mentioning it in a condition of the state address. So I hadn't heard about that Arkansas study. That's interesting. It also reminds me I have an email to go out to Iowa HHS to see if they've sent that waiver request in yet. Put it
Yeah.
on Erin's to-do list.
I think Georgia's the only state left that still has a work requirement,
Okay.
and that it only subjects clients who are part of the Medicaid expansion, not the previous program.
That's right. Yep.
So yeah, it's yeah.
All right. Well, make sure you check out Todd's column on that one. Has that published already? I hadn't.
Oh
seen
yeah,
it.
yeah. It's
Oh, it has. Okay.
yeah, it's already in the bird cage. So
All right. Check that one out. Lastly, this week, as I alluded to at the top, some campaign fundraising reports were due for state office holders who were not on the ballot in the 2024 election. So we got a little glimpse into what these folks were doing in the fundraising trail during an off year. Perhaps the most noteworthy number to come out of the reports came from State Auditor Rob Sand, the only statewide Democratic office holder in Iowa. Sand raised $8 million in 2024. Bears noting here that $7 million of that came from his family, from his wife and his in-laws. So that's a big caveat to that big number. Although, as Sand's campaign pointed out, he did also have more than 28,000 individual donations, and that is legitimately a gigantic number compared to other candidates in previous campaigns, especially in an off year, but in some cases in any year. Todd, let me ask you this. Sand has not yet announced his intentions for 2026. He could run for re-election as auditor. He's been believed to be a potential candidate for governor. Todd, $8 million, $7 million from the family. Was that a de facto gubernatorial campaign announcement from Rob Sand?
Yeah, he's going to run. He wouldn't be creating that kind of stockpile. And really, if you take the $7 million away, he almost raised as much as the governor did last year.
Right. Yeah, both around 1.7, 1.8 million if you take his 7 million out.
And also, if this is a guy that can convince his in-laws to give him $7 million for a campaign, he must be a pretty extraordinary guy, I would say. He might want to incorporate that into some sort of advertising. Because
it's funny you say that, because we had a conversation about that with some of the other State House reporters as we're kind of milling around on the press bench. We're joking about how much money we'd be able to get out of our in-laws.
Yeah, it's a lot of money, and to start out, we're sort of in that campaign cycle, but not exactly. So it's a pretty well. For one thing, it's going to scare off other Democrats, I suppose.
Thank you, because I was going to ask you that. Yeah, is that a shot across the bow? Is that an attempt to clear the primary field?
Yeah, I think it will, regardless of whether that's the intent. Which I think is actually too bad, because I think Democrats could have really used a good primary to sort of, have their debates and flesh out their ideas. And now, Sand runs the risks of becoming, the next Bruce Braley, who cleared the field and then was, barely made a ripple through the entire Republican primary process. And
the list doesn't stop there, Todd. You can go to Patty Judge in 2000, although she was facing Chuck Grassley, but regardless, Fred Hubble. Fred was the one that did have a competitive primary.
Yeah, I think there were six people running at that point.
So sorry, I should exclude them. And then Teresa Greenfield against Ernst in 20 is the other one I'm thinking of. How many times have we seen Democrats clear the field, and the wins and losses speak for themselves there at what's come after?
Yeah, I just think it exposes the party to, they get media attention, people pay some attention, they run advertising against each other or just in favor of themselves. So if you just have to sit there and maybe he won't. Maybe Reynolds runs for re-election and that general election race starts on day one. But if Reynolds doesn't run and they have, I would assume that there would be multiple Republicans who would run, then that would leave Sand sort of sitting on the sidelines until that's settled. And I don't think that's necessarily good for him.
Yeah. All right, man, a lot to talk about this week, and a lot of it's forward-looking too, so we'll have to follow up with a lot of this stuff in future episodes. But that's going to do it for this one. And then if you were on watching us on the YouTube, Jared had to bail at a certain point, duty calls, so we didn't get to him, but he'll be back with us hopefully soon. But Jared's well. Don't worry about him if you saw him disappear. That'll do it for this episode of On Iowa Politics. If you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service choice or on YouTube, where you can also smash that like button. And you can find the podcast each week also on your preferred Gazette or Lee newspaper website. We'd love you to find it there too for the clicks. And now that you've listened to the On Iowa Politics podcast, make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to the free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And lastly, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. For the whole gang this week, Tom Barton, Maya Marchel Hoff, Sarah Watson, Jared McNett, Todd Producer. I've done that before, I think. I get ahead of myself. Todd Dorman and our producer, Bailey Chehan. I'm Erin Murphy. Be well, everyone, and be good.